The city never truly slept, but some nights it held its breath. Officer Grayson Steele could feel it in the air. Something electric, something wrong. His boots echoed against the cracked pavement as he stepped deeper into the alley. The glow of neon signs painting the brick walls in flickering reds and blues. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, the distant hum of the city muffled by the narrow walls surrounding him. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not officially. A call had come in about a disturbance behind the old Royale Theater. An abandoned venue turned underground fight club, if the rumors were true. The captain had told Grayson to ignore it, to let the unofficial channels handle it. But Grayson had never been good at looking the other way. And now, standing here in the shadows, he realized he might have made a mistake. Because at the other end of the alley stood a man who needed no introduction. Chuck Norris, the legend himself, clad in a simple denim jacket, arms crossed over his chest, eyes sharp as a hunter's. His presence alone felt like a shift in gravity, as if the alley itself bent around him. Grayson swallowed hard. Didn't expect company, Chuck said, his voice like gravel over steel. Grayson tightened his grip on his baton, his knuckles whitening around the worn leather handle. Didn't expect to find you here. Chuck smirked, tilting his head slightly. You should have stayed home, kid. Grayson bristled at that. Kid? He wasn't some rookie fresh out of the academy. He'd been through hell, fought criminals twice his size, stared down the barrel of too many guns to count. And yet, in the presence of this man, he felt something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to doubt. Grayson squared his shoulders, forcing steel into his spine. He wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. I go where the job takes me, he said. Chuck let out a small chuckle, the kind that sent a chill down a man's back. Is that right? The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of sirens, too far to matter. The city was a jungle, and tonight, Grayson was stepping into the lion's den. He was no ordinary cop. The stories about him had spread through the department like wildfire. The guy with unnatural reflexes. The officer who could read a fight before it even began. Some whispered that he had a sixth sense for danger, a gift that set him apart from every other badge-wearing lawman. Others muttered a different word, freak. Grayson never cared much for what people thought. His instincts had saved lives. That was all that mattered. But as he stood in front of the Chuck Norris, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The alley was silent, save for the faint dripping of water from a rusted fire escape. Chuck's eyes studied him, unblinking, as if sizing up a man before the kill. There was no arrogance in his stance, no overconfidence, just an undeniable certainty, the kind only a warrior carried. Grayson tightened his grip on the baton at his side. Word is, something illegal is going down here. That true? Chuck didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound against the damp concrete. He was a panther, moving with the patience of someone who knew he didn't need to rush. You ever ask yourself what you're really chasing, officer? Chuck's voice was calm, too calm. The law? Justice? Or just a chance to prove you're something more than what they say you are? Grayson's jaw clenched. He didn't need this. Not from a man he had never met before. I don't have time for riddles. Step aside. Chuck tilted his head, eyes glinting under the distant glow of a streetlight. You want to go through me? Grayson exhaled slowly. He didn't come here for a fight, but something in the air, some unspoken challenge, was pushing him forward. Maybe it was Chuck's words. Maybe it was the years of proving himself against a world that always seemed to doubt him. Maybe, just maybe, it was the chance to stand in front of a legend and not blink. He lifted his baton. Chuck smiled. All right, kid, he said. Show me what you've got. Grayson didn't hesitate. He moved. Lightning fast, the baton whistled through the air. A blur of polished steel aimed straight for Chuck's shoulder. A controlled strike, not lethal, but enough to stun. Enough to show he wasn't just some beat cop with an attitude. Chuck didn't move. Not until the last possible second. Then, like a shadow breaking apart, he shifted to the side, the baton slicing through nothing. Grayson barely had time to register it before. Crack? A fist slammed into his wrist, numbing his entire arm. The baton clattered to the ground, rolling into a puddle. Grayson's instinct screamed at him to move, but before he could react, Chuck was already in motion. A spin, a blur, a kick. Grayson barely ducked in time, the wind from Chuck's roundhouse grazing the back of his neck. He rolled to the side, snatching up his baton in one fluid motion. This time, he didn't wait. He came in low, feinting to the left before snapping a strike toward Chuck's ribs. A mistake. Chuck caught the baton mid-strike, his grip like iron. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Then, with nothing more than a flick of his wrist, Chuck twisted, disarming Grayson completely. The baton spun through the air before landing with a dull thud behind him. Grayson stood there, chest rising and falling, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd fought trained fighters before, criminals who had spent years learning how to hurt people. But this was something else entirely. Chuck let go of his wrist and took a step back, as calm as if they had just finished a friendly spar. "You've got speed," Chuck admitted, "but speed isn't everything." Grayson exhaled through his nose, the sting of failure burning hot in his chest. "That right?" he muttered, rolling his shoulder. Chuck nodded. "Speed fades. Instincts can be wrong. You rely too much on what you think you know." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "And what do you know?" Chuck's smile was almost imperceptible. "I know that if you come at me again, you'll lose twice as fast." The words should have angered him, but instead, they did something far worse. They rang true. Grayson wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting a legend. But damn it all if he was going to back down now. He lunged. Grayson moved with everything he had. A burst of speed, a pivot on his back foot. His hands flew toward Chuck's midsection in a feint before snapping up toward his jaw. It was a move designed to force an opponent's guard down. Most men would fall for it. Chuck wasn't most men. Before Grayson's fist could land, Chuck was already inside his reach, cutting through the attack like a blade through water. Then came the counterattack. A palm strike to the chest, precise, controlled. It wasn't meant to break anything, but it sent Grayson stumbling backward. He barely managed to keep his footing, breath knocked from his lungs. Chuck shook his head. "Too aggressive. You strike first without knowing where it'll land." Grayson gritted his teeth. His pulse pounded in his ears, his muscles screaming for him to react, to move. He trained for years, fought against men who wanted him dead. But here, against this man, he felt like a kid throwing punches at a hurricane. No. He wouldn't let this shake him. He surged forward again, faster this time, launching a sweeping kick aimed at Chuck's legs. It was a bold move, one that had taken down men twice his size. Chuck stepped over it. In one fluid motion, he pivoted on his heel, rotating his entire body like a coiled spring. Before Grayson could even process what was happening, Chuck's legs snapped up in a perfect arc. A roundhouse kick, the kind that could stop time. Grayson barely threw up his arms before the impact landed. Bone met bone, sending a shockwave through his body. His arms absorbed most of the force, but the sheer power behind the kick sent him skidding backward, boots screeching against concrete. For the first time in his career, he felt outmatched. Chuck lowered his leg, eyes locked onto Grayson's. "You're fighting like a man who's trying to prove something." Grayson spat onto the pavement, shaking the numbness out of his arms. "Maybe I am." Chuck exhaled through his nose, stepping forward again. Not to attack, but to test. His movements were deliberate, almost lazy, like a predator circling prey. "And what exactly are you proving?" Grayson's grip tightened into fists. He wasn't about to start pouring his soul out in the middle of a back alley fight. But deep down, he knew the answer. His whole life, he had been different. His reactions were faster than most. His instincts sharper. The other officers at the precinct either envied him or feared him, calling him things like super cop or robot. They didn't understand. They never did. So he worked harder, pushed further. But here, against Chuck, he wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the sharpest. He was just another fighter getting his ass handed to him. And it burned. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Then, Without a word, he attacked again. This time, he didn't aim for speed. He aimed for control. A tight sequence: left jab, right cross, feint low, knee strike. Chuck dodged the first two, deflected the third. But the knee? That one came close. Chuck shifted at the last second, the blow grazing his ribcage instead of landing clean. Grayson saw it. The first opening. He capitalized on it immediately, dropping low and sweeping his baton from the ground. He struck out and connected. Crack. The baton smacked against Chuck's ribs, the impact sending a sharp echo down the alley. It wasn't a devastating hit, but it was something. For the first time since the fight started, Chuck staggered. The world seemed to hold its breath. Chuck looked down at his side, rolling his shoulder. Then, to Grayson's complete disbelief, he smiled. Not bad, Chuck admitted. Grayson's chest heaved, sweat dripping from his brow. He didn't move, didn't lower his guard. His entire body was screaming at him to be ready for anything. Then, Chuck did something unexpected. He stepped back. The fight's over, he said. Grayson blinked. What? Chuck nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. You win. Grayson stared at him like he had grown a second head. He knew he hadn't won. The baton strike was one hit, barely enough to make a dent. If anything, Chuck had been toying with him. And yet, he wasn't attacking. Why? Grayson asked, suspicion laced in his tone. Chuck's gaze softened, just enough for Grayson to notice. Because you finally stopped fighting for the wrong reason. Silence stretched between them. Chuck gestured toward the baton, still gripped tightly in Grayson's hand. You weren't trying to win just now. You were adapting, thinking, fighting with your head, not just your instincts. He nodded in approval. That's the difference between a good fighter and a great one. Grayson felt his breath slow. His muscles still ached, adrenaline still pumped through his veins. But something inside him shifted. For years, he had thought strength was about proving yourself, about outmatching everyone else, about winning. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was about learning. Chuck clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm but not overpowering. Lessons over, kid. Grayson exhaled, a smirk tugging at his lips. Does that mean I get a rematch someday? Chuck chuckled. Maybe, if you survive. Grayson laughed, shaking his head. His ribs hurt, his pride was bruised. But for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. Because tonight, he didn't just fight Chuck Norris. He walked away with something far more valuable. The city stretched beyond the alleyway, its skyline glowing like embers in the night. The distant hum of traffic reminded Grayson that the world was still moving, even as he stood there, beaten, exhausted, and strangely at peace. Chuck Norris had just handed him the most brutal lesson of his life. And yet, there was no bitterness in it, no humiliation, only growth. He flexed his fingers around the baton, rolling his wrist. His body ached from the relentless counters. His ribs felt tender where Chuck's roundhouse had nearly broken through his guard. But none of it mattered as much as the words Chuck had left him with. Strength wasn't about proving yourself. It was about knowing yourself. Grayson had spent years trying to outmatch, outfight, outthink, outmaneuver. But tonight, he had learned the real secret. He had been so caught up in proving his worth that he had never stopped to consider the real fight wasn't against others. It was against himself. Chuck stood a few feet away, his stance now relaxed, as if the entire battle had never happened. If the blows had hurt him, he didn't show it. Unshaken, unbothered. That's what real power looked like. Grayson let out a slow breath. You knew I wasn't gonna win, he finally said. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Chuck tilted his head slightly. Winning was never the point. Grayson nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. The fight had been real, but now, in the aftermath, he understood. Chuck hadn't been trying to defeat him. He had been teaching him. You fight well, Chuck continued, his voice steady. But you fight angry, like you're chasing something just beyond your reach. His sharp eyes met Grayson's. What is it? Grayson hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man to talk about these things, not to his fellow officers, not even to himself. But standing here, after this, He felt like hiding from the truth wasn't an option anymore. My whole life, he said finally, people have looked at me like I'm different. Too fast, too sharp, too instinctual. He exhaled. Some respect it, some fear it, but none of them understand it. Chuck nodded, listening. I figured if I kept proving myself, kept winning, they'd have to take me seriously. Grayson looked down at the baton still in his grip. But tonight, for the first time, I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the strongest. I wasn't the best. Chuck finished for him. Grayson met his gaze. Yeah. Chuck let the silence linger before stepping closer. Let me tell you something, kid. He gestured toward the baton. That thing in your hand? It's just a tool. Like your badge, like your fists. But a tool is only as strong as the man who wields it. He held up a finger. And strength isn't about being the best. It's about knowing when to fight. His hand lowered slightly. And when to listen. Grayson felt those words settle deep inside him. For years, he had pushed himself beyond limits, forcing his way through every obstacle, thinking that if he was just strong enough, people would see him for what he really was. But strength wasn't pushing, it was understanding. Chuck gave him a knowing look. You're fast, but speed fades. Grayson nodded. Yeah, you said that before. Chuck smirked. Because it's true. But wisdom? He tapped the side of his head. That lasts forever. Grayson let those words settle, turning them over in his mind. He thought about his years in the force, the fights, the chases, the endless need to prove himself. Maybe, just maybe, he had been looking at it all wrong. Maybe it was never about being the best. Maybe it was about being better than yesterday. The alley was quiet now, only the sound of the distant city filling the space between them. Chuck stretched his arms slightly, then gave Grayson one last nod. You're good, kid, he said. And one day, you'll be great. Grayson felt something tighten in his chest. Not pride, not arrogance, just understanding. Chuck turned, walking toward the mouth of the alley. Until then, he called over his shoulder, try not to get yourself killed. Grayson smirked. No promises. And just like that, Chuck Norris disappeared into the night, leaving behind a man who was no longer fighting to prove something, but fighting to become something more. The real battle had just begun.